Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Fantastic as always. It's been a while since we've done really anything on systems, and we got to talking in the hallway with some students the other day about some pitot stuff, and that led to more questions and more questions and more questions. And that's normally how we find the content that we want to share with our listeners. So today we are going to talk about the pitot system. The students were asking, the proverbial Wally questions around, what am I going to get asked on the check ride? What can I do? What should I study for? And I think that's pretty simple, whatever the PHAC and the Airplane Flying Handbook says, and know the ACS. But it did curtail into a lot of good conversation that we thought we would share with everyone. So we're going to break it down into 3 components and probably get off on some tangents as we go. But we're going to talk about the components of the pitot system, how each of those components work, and then kind of common malfunctions and failures, along with just some common sense that you can incorporate in your flying to be a better pilot. Well, everybody wants to know, what do people struggle with on check rides as it relates to this system, or these items, these instruments that use the system? What do you see private pilots struggle with, assuming they talk about it more on their check rides than all the others?
Yeah, right off the bat, I will go through the instrument panel and talk about how each, or basically, I don't know if power sources is the right word, but power sources for the flight instruments. And typically, we have 6 flight instruments, and typically 3 of them are pitot, 2 of them are vacuum, and 1 of them is electric. That can vary. A lot of vacuum systems are going away, with G5s and that sort of things. You could have a turn coordinator that is not electric. It could be vacuum. That's kind of unusual, but we do see that. So right off the bat, a lot of times people just struggle with what system powers. That's not.
I say drives. Drives might be the right word there, technically.
Yeah.
Which drives the system.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. That's probably a better word, because you say power, we think electricity. But so right off the bat, that is something that most people, I would say most applicants, it's just not on the tip of their tongue, and I really kind of think it ought to be. And usually we have a picture of a panel in the room that we're doing the check ride with, and I'll say, well, it's there for them to look at, and if you look at most turn coordinators, it says right on there ELEC, so that might tell you that it's electrically powered. You look at most attitude indicators and maybe even directional gyros, and it probably says vacuum on there. So the answer is right in front of you. You just got to look.
Yeah, and I think these systems, specifically the pitot system, the airspeed, the vertical speed indicator, these blockage things we're going to talk about, right? For an older guy who started flying, right? None of this stuff made a lot of sense to me. But these systems are very good at what they do. They're still the same thing that was made a long, long time ago. And almost, I would say, every aircraft at some level uses the pressures, static pressure, to help understand altitude and if it moves forward, probably airspeed through the pitot tube. So let's break down each component of the pitot system, and then talk a little bit about what drives them and what people should know about them. So obviously the pitot tube sticks out normally in front of the airfoil, the wing, so that it's not getting disrupted air to it. And very important tool. We also normally see a red thing on that pitot tube. And we'll talk about why that red thing's really important later on. But that pitot tube is really getting ram air. So as the aircraft starts moving forward, some pressure from the ram air is going into that tube and telling the airspeed indicator something. How many of those instruments use the ram air, Wally? What all instruments use the ram air?
Well, the airspeed indicator uses
Just
the ram
one.
air, and I'll tell you a kind of a nerdy, funny story about a pitot tube. My father was notorious at his, he was a professional pilot, and he was notorious for bringing pieces of airplanes home and giving them to me and teaching me about them when I was very young. I mean, second, third grade, that kind of thing. And he brought a pitot tube home one day, and it obviously had a malfunction and was taken off an airplane. And most second graders probably played with normal toys, but that was something I had, and this was back in the day. I don't know if they still do show and tell in school or not, but
I have a box in my office. I do it very often.
Back in the 60s, 70s, we used to go to school and we'd have show and tell, and you got to stand up in front of the class and show something that you had or tell something. And I can remember taking a pitot tube to school. I was probably in second grade, and doing show and tell and teaching everybody all about pitot tubes.
Interesting. Well, it turns you into a great pilot and a career pilot, to say the least.
Yeah.
But a broken open tube is very interesting. You can see the heater elements and the other components that are built into that pitot tube, right? A pitot tube's made up of both the ram air inlet, we'll call it a hole. They have a drain hole in the back, and they've got a heater element that is controlled by a switch, most often in the cockpit there, where the pilot can control it and makes it work, right? We'll talk about the errors or the blockages that occur, but we're up at, even in a Cessna, you're at 5,000 feet on a 50-degree day. In invisible moisture, you might be in some conditions that would cause that to get ice on it, and it would be very important to make sure that was clear and didn't have ice in it, because we would ultimately see some problems with our airspeed indicators.
Right.
And maybe multiple. We've been chasing a problem lately with a digital airspeed indicator and a backup airspeed indicator, and it's not always obvious where the blockage is. It could be deep inside that system somewhere, which would be causing inconsistencies amongst multiple indicators inside the cockpit for the pilot. We also have the actual dial inside the cockpit, which is the airspeed indicator, obviously interpreting the information that it's getting from the pitot tube, and the static port. We have the static port, which some planes have one, some planes have two. I don't think I've ever seen three, but surely there's somebody out there that's got multiple static ports. And then there's an alternate static in most of the trainers that we have at our school. I would think in today's world, Wally, do you see a plane ever that doesn't have an alternate static inside the cockpit?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Offhand, I don't think of any, but I'm sure there are some.
And then the other two instruments inside the cockpit are the vertical speed indicator and the altimeter that are using the static port to read the outside pressure of the aircraft and then doing something with that information. So I'll let you're much smarter than me. I'll let you describe how the vertical speed indicator and the altimeter work, Wally, using the static port information.
Well, they basically measured the difference in pressure. The vertical speed, is probably an instrument that we don't use a whole lot as maybe VFR pilots, but it is a very nice instrument to have, especially on when you start flying instrument conditions, to have an idea of what rate of descent you're going to want on an approach to have, just have a good idea of what you're doing. I talk a lot about electrical failures on check rides, instrument check rides, and we talk about if all else fails and we had to come down without our electrical system, that vertical speed becomes very, very important. Again, as VFR pilots, it's probably not something we're looking at a whole lot, but instrument conditions, very much so. Now, what you got to know that a lot of times it lags a little bit. So, I can remember my first instructor telling me it was a history book. The vertical speed indicator was a history book rather than telling you what's happening right now. The other time you might use it is maybe on steep turns. I had a situation with a student, was actually doing some teaching the other day, and the young man was struggling with steep turns, and I just covered up the panel and said, "Look out the window," and he was amazed. He said, "Wow, I've never done that." It's a lot easier to look outside. So I know I'm not talking about pitot systems, but as it relates to the vertical speed indicator.
Well, we can get fixated on stuff, and I like the history book because it is a delay. And during the research that I did to prepare for this show, because I don't think about the details of all this every day, it said it's about 6 to 9 seconds in the past. So it takes about 6 to 9 seconds for the calibrated leak to equalize or get to a common pressure change based on the static port and the information that it's getting on the other side of that controlled leak or calibrated leak, which I found very interesting. So if you started to climb, it's going to be 6 seconds before they begin balancing or begin to share the right information. And if you only climbed for 12 seconds, it'd be right for it'd be right for 6 or 7 seconds there in the middle, and then start changing your altitude again. It's going to be lagging on that, but very good information. And I remember chasing that thing a lot when I was a student pilot trying to learn how to climb and go out to the practice area or come back to the pattern. I think much like a new IFR pilot's probably chasing a track that they're supposed to be on, I think a VFR pilot starts chasing that needle, and it's because it is history, it's almost impossible to keep up with it for new pilots, for sure.
Very much so. One thing I have learned to do myself is anytime I get in an airplane, it just bothers me if I look over and I see that the altimeter is way off of field elevation. So the first thing I do, and this is just my technique, this is just the way I do it. There's no, this isn't the way you got to do it. The first thing I want to do is set my altimeter to field elevation. And if I notice that the altimeter is significantly off of field elevation, it sends up a flag, and it says to me, there has been a significant change in the weather since this airplane last flew. Now, maybe the airplane hadn't flown in a year, okay? But maybe it hasn't, flight schools, we have a good weather day, then we have 3 days of bad weather and the airplanes don't fly, and then we come back in and the pressure is significantly different. It tells me that the airplane probably hasn't flown in a couple days, and it really kind of affects how I'm going to do the pre-flight. Significant change in weather, maybe we've had a lot of rain. It's going to be, am I going to be more cognizant of checking the fuel? I'd like to say every time I check the fuel the same way, but there's more. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it, but maybe my awareness is much higher, knowing that.
I was going to say angst. There's a little bit more anxiety about,
exactly.
Could there be water in the fuel, right?
Right.
Did it start raining when the plane was parked and they didn't put any fuel in it, but the tanks are full, right? That would be a big problem, because that would be a lot of water and some avgas as well. I probably am going to sump that a little bit more closely in that case because the pressure is so far from what it was when that plane was parked for sure.
Right.
Well, talking about pre-flight, there's a number of things, and I've seen, golly, I feel like I've seen everything, and somebody's going to prove me wrong tomorrow, Wally, but, I've seen a lot. We pay a few young men and women to wash our planes. We call them rampers. They move our planes around on the ramp, right? While we try really hard to use a big piece of blue tape or red painter's tape or blue painter's tape, when we wash our planes, we cover up the static ports. Sometimes that gets forgotten. Man, I saw a ramper one time use a clear piece of tape, and I lost it because that's extremely dangerous in that world where they, even someone pre-flighting might not notice a clear piece of tape. But you've surely seen a pitot static port covered up with a piece of tape or something. But that big red thing hanging off the pitot tube, have you ever had someone leave that on during a check ride, Wally?
I have. And we taxied out, and he actually took off. And he noticed it rolling down the runway, and he elected to take off. So here we are. Now we're in the air. We're flying. And we don't have any airspeed indication. We had airspeed because we flew, right? So what do you do in that situation? Well, first of all, I mean, he shouldn't have taken off. So we had a in-depth discussion on that, and we talked about how when he came back for his next check ride that we would be evaluating that. Anyway, if you can read between the lines there.
Yes.
So here we are. You're in the air. Let's say the airspeed just fails, okay? Or in our case, we took off with it having failed. What are you going to do? And this is what, at this point the check ride was over, so it became a little bit of a teaching moment for him. But most airplanes today now have a GPS. So we have a ground speed readout. So what I said to him, I says, we're going to maintain our runway heading, and we're going to level off. And we're going to take a look at our ground speed. And I'll use easy math here. Let's say it's 100. I says, now we're going to turn crosswind, and we're going to turn downwind. We're going to turn 180 degrees eventually, and we're going to look at the airspeed again. Now, if that airspeed, when we've made that 180 degree turn, or ground speed rather, if the ground speed when we make that 180 degree turn is the same, we've got a pretty good idea that we don't have any wind.
Calm day.
Okay, so if it's, let's say it's 100 on upwind, and we make a turn to the downwind, and now it's 120, that's a 20 knot split. That tells me that we had a 10 knot headwind when we took off. So that would tell me that my airspeed is probably 110. For 100 on upwind, 120 on downwind, split the difference, and that gives you an idea of what your ground speed is. And of course, you're going to turn base, you're going to turn final, knowing that you've got that headwind again.
Yep. And I think that's something we should all be able to do inside of a plane, because you never know. I think we talk about the book knowledge all the time about icing and getting plugged for ice. But I actually think in Houston, Texas, it's more likely that a monster mosquito is going to cause you a bigger problem in our aircraft. Something that's going to either create a home or get hit by the plane as we're taking off, i.e. a bug flies into the tube, or a mud dauber fills it full of mud, right? Some sort of a burrowing type animal like that, or an insect. But that's why you got to make sure that pitot tube cover is always on there. You got to be diligent if you fly to fly school and you can't find it because someone they took it home on accident or whatever, the school really wants to know, because they don't want any issues to be created inside of that system with little bugs that would want to find a nice place to stay dry and warm during the fall time of year that we're in, kind of the almost winter to spring right now. It's perfectly nice for a bird or a bug to get up in those pitot tubes at this point, and that would be a very bad thing for both student and school for sure.
And also, don't think because your airplane is a hangar that it's not an issue.
Oh, exactly right. Yeah.
Don't have the attitude, well, I hangar the airplane, I don't need to put that pitot cover on, that pitot tube cover on there, because that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I have a couple, or have one airplane now, and I've had it bugs get in it in a hangar, and it was uncovered. So I fell into that trap years ago of thinking, oh, it's hangared, I don't need to put the pitot tube cover on it. But guess what?
Maybe more bugs in a hangar, just because there's a lot more dryness in there for bugs to get in there. Maybe a little bit of light. You never know. You should definitely put that pitot tube cover on every time and always. And I think I see probably people get lazy with the low wings because it's a little bit more work. It's a little harder to get down there and put that little mast cover on a low wing plane there. That, it's kind of more like a blade than it is a pitot tube. Right. And it's a little harder to get up underneath there and cover that thing up, but super critical if you want to ensure that you don't have any of those issues when you go flying on a given day, for sure. So we talked about tape. We talked about, the pitot tube cover. We talked about bugs. There is the ice thing, and there's a lot of errors that could be presented to pilots and some common sense, but it really wasn't common sense to me when I was a new pilot. I struggled with these high to low, look out below, all these pressure sayings, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. And I think I've shared on the show, but whatever it was about a weather balloon kind of made it click for me. A weather balloon takes off and the balloon's pretty small. If you look at pictures on the Google, you can see a weather balloon at altitude. That balloon's huge. And it really is because those gases inside that balloon have the chance to expand because the air is much thinner up there. And that just put pressure in my mind. It just kind of made sense, right? Down close to the ground, the balloon's kind of squished by all the other molecules down here. Up in the air, everything kind of expands, and there's a lot less molecules up there. And that's really what the altimeter's reading, the vertical speed indicator is, with that calibrated leak is managing that for us as well. And then the airspeed is RAM versus that static pressure at whatever altitude we're at, so the system knows what's going on. So what kind of common errors should we see or expect? And I know you probably get tired of hearing this, Wally, but all the listeners want to know, like, what do people struggle with on check rides, and kind of what's a DPE really trying to evaluate? Obviously, it's systems knowledge, but what kind of tips and tricks can we give to the listeners out there that might be taking check rides?
Well, one thing I do with for sure private check rides is I talk about their cross country. I say, okay, we're going from airport A to airport B, and this is during the ground portion, and I kind of create a divert scenario. Let's say we're halfway to airport B, and we decide we need to divert. Maybe we just need to go to the bathroom or whatever. It's not an emergency, so we'll pick an airport, and I'll use that opportunity to talk about that airport. That's how we talk about, okay, what are the notches on the 3, 6, and 9 o'clock on the airport, the color of the airport, what type of airspace, runway length, all that kind of stuff. And so I say, okay, let's say we land at this airport, and we jump in the crew car. Let's say there's not much going on at this airport. We jump in the crew car, we go have lunch, and we come back, and we get in the airplane, and the ASOS isn't working. so we can't really get the weather. But we look out the window, we see there's not a cloud in the sky. The car just told us that it was 75 degrees. We can look at the windsock and see that it's basically limp. So we know that, and we just came in. We know the visibility is really good. So we know the visibility, we know the clouds, we know the temperature, we know the wind. The one piece of the weather puzzle that we don't have is the altimeter. And I will say, how do we know the altimeter? And boy, it's, of course, everybody says, well, I'll look it up on my phone. I say, well, we don't have cell service. And a lot of people really struggle with that. And that goes back to what I just said. Just set field elevation and, whatever it reads is what it reads. If I put in 150 feet, if that's what field elevation is, and I can look at it and see that the altimeter is 3023.
Yeah, that's one of those things that evaded me as a young pilot. And still, I think due to the fact that I've always got it on my phone or I've always got access to the radio now, I kind of just expect to get it from somewhere else. But it's pretty easy to sit down in the cockpit in the pilot's seat and just turn that dial and figure out what it is that day. You're going to be within a 0.01 or 0.02 of that number almost every time if you know the field elevation. And that's published, so you should be able to get that for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of times I'll say, well, let's go get in an airplane, and we'll walk out and find an airplane. We'll jump in it, and we'll talk about that. And eventually they'll get it, and they'll say, oh, I think the altimeter is 3025, and I'll say, let's turn on the master switch and let's listen to the ATIS. And lo and behold, altimeter 3026. Okay, 10 feet off. So it's really, really close.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing that I don't think I really understood or comprehended probably until my instrument training, but a very easy way to get that number and be accurate to precision and not just kind of wing it or guess at it, right? For sure.
Right, yeah.
So what happens, like you probably talked through some blockage scenarios, probably more maybe on instrument check rides or whatever, but some of this never made sense, but I think if you understand how the systems work, how the tools work, how the airspeed indicator works, then you quickly learn or understand, maybe not even learn. It's not the rote knowledge that makes us good pilots. It's understanding the systems. And if the ram hole, the inlet, gets covered up, I'm obviously not going to have any airspeed indication. If the drain hole isn't covered up, it's just going to read 0 because the static and the difference is going to be the same. So it's just going to say 0. But what if the drain hole's covered up and the pitot tube is covered up, meaning the inlet for the ram air is covered up? Then the pressure is going to be trapped, and that's going to be trapped at some altitude. And we just talked about this, right? So whatever the field elevation was when that got trapped, assuming a bug covered it up, or if we're climbing out at 1,000 feet and we hit a big bug or a bird and it covers those two holes up, at whatever altitude we're at, that's what's going to be trapped in that system, assuming it's completely covered up. And we're going to have a problem, right? It's going to act more as an altimeter in that instance because it's trapped pressure.
Right. And this is where a simulator is worth its weight in gold because other than the pitot tube situation, I don't know if I've ever really had a pitot-static system malfunction in an airplane. I'm trying to think. I don't think I ever have.
And that's why the dang system's so good at what it does and why it's still the system we all use in almost every aircraft we fly.
Exactly. But a simulator, you can the instructor or whoever is operating the simulator can fail certain systems and say, okay, this is what looks like. This is what a blockage of this looks like. This is what icing would look like. These are the symptoms of it.
And it doesn't have to be the rote knowledge. You can actually climb 3,000 more feet and say, oh, now I understand what you mean by altimeter, because as I went higher, the number got higher. And as I went lower, the number got lower. And I see it, and I truly understand what's going on. It's just not me reading it in a book and trying to remember the acronym or the phraseology so that I don't forget that stuff.
Yeah. And, I remember myself as a private pilot, a non-instrument rated private pilot. I kind of had the attitude of, well, that pitot heat switch doesn't apply to me because I'm not instrument rated. I had the attitude of, well, if I don't fly into a cloud, I'm not gonna need it. But that's not the case, because there could be a cloud above with falling precipitation, and if the airplane is cold enough, it could freeze on the airplane. So, that was definitely the wrong attitude to have 40 some odd years ago.
Yeah, you're going to want that airspeed. I mean, it's going to make it a lot easier to land if you're a new pilot. You're going to want that airspeed, because we know a combination of that and an electrical failure is going to be a huge emergency for a private pilot. No question whatsoever, for sure.
Yeah, and don't think it has to be freezing. In fact, I was just in an airplane within the last 2 days. I don't remember where it was, but the placard said that anytime you're in visible moisture and less than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that the pitot heat, it said, must be turned on.
Yeah.
So, in bigger airplanes and jets, we have this thing called ram rise, and what that is the actual friction of the air going through the pitot tube causes heat. So we'll have two temperatures that we look at. One static temperature, and that might be minus 56. Up at altitude, and then we have total air temperature, which is going to be warmer, so it might be minus 38 or something like that. So, and that's not really an issue with 100-knot airplanes, but again, anytime you're anywhere close to freezing, you probably want to get that pitot heat on.
So
with visible moisture.
Sure. If we're up at altitude, call it 5,000 feet, visible moisture, 40-degree day, we're going to be in some icing conditions. We want to get out of that in a Cessna for sure, but let's assume the static port does get frozen over, right? We don't have a piece of tape on there. The static port's frozen. We're going to get a lot of abnormal information because all three instruments use the static pressure for information. And like I said earlier, most of our trainers have an alternate static. We pull it to check it. And when we pull it, we normally see things bounce a little bit. It normally is fairly quick. Vertical speed and the altimeter kind of move a little bit. And we know, okay, it released some air or static pressure into that system. And it's going to be slightly different. If you ever have to use it, or if you're flying a plane, you should know what the POH says about it. Some are pretty basic and just say, it's going to be 15 feet off or 2 knots off. If that's what the book says, know that information. Some books, Cessna 172s, have a pretty involved chart that talks about the different numbers, if the windows are open or if the windows are closed, if the flaps are down. It's a lot of information that will make those numbers vary if you have to use that alternate static pressure, but you should know that information for the airplane that you're in. Yeah.
And basically, you're using a port that is now inside the airplane.
Yep.
And that's the difference. And so is the pressure inside the airplane different from outside the airplane? And it is a little bit. Not, it's not significant, but it's a little bit different.
Yeah, and I never understood. I read it again today, but it truly is the Bernoulli's principle of the airflow over the fuselage, which creates a little bit of a differing pressure inside the airplane, which does make more sense to me today than it did when I was a 20-hour pilot. But it just know it's different, and the book will tell you what it's going to be different. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, that alternate static pressure also becomes clogged, you don't have one, there's one fail-safe that you can always do. I've always read about it. I don't want anybody to ever try it at my flight school, but it is breaking the glass on the vertical speed indicator. And really what you're doing by breaking that glass is you're opening the static system to another source of static pressure, which again would be the same pressure inside the cockpit. If you need to use it because you're in an emergency, by all means, break the glass, but don't go demonstrate it for someone because those instruments are very expensive and we don't want to break the glass. But if you have to, when you break the glass on the vertical speed indicator, you're actually letting static pressure into the system kind of behind the walls of all those other instruments, and you will start to see information that you're expecting to see in those instruments as well.
And we say the VSI because we figure that is the instrument that is needed the least. So, because you're probably going to ruin the instrument when you do that. So that's why we pick the vertical speed.
For sure. Any other tips and tricks you can give the private or instrument students that are days away from check rides that may, I know they want to impress the DPE, but maybe want to impress themselves with the knowledge that they should be understanding before they go in that room?
No, I mean, it's just a matter of knowing which system drives which instruments, and knowing, if we have a pitot problem, what instruments it's going to affect. Is a pitot problem going to affect our heading? No, it's not going to affect our heading. Consequently, we can, what's a vacuum pump failure going to affect? And, if we look over and we have 0 on the vacuum gauge, is our altimeter still working? Yeah, it is. And you need to know that stuff. We need to know, I'm trying to relate it to something in your car, but, is the radio in your car is working? Is it not working? Is it going to affect your ability to drive to work tomorrow? Well, no, it's not. It doesn't really affect the engine. So know what system drives which instruments, an electrical failure. If you have any electrical instruments on your 6-pack, what you're going to have or what you're not going to have.
But Wally, if their Bluetooth doesn't work tomorrow, they're not going to be able to listen to the show on their way to the office. That would be detrimental to most of our listeners, I would assume.
That would be very bad.
All right. Well, really good show. We've been wanting to do more kind of teaching or more kind of system type content that helps you guys and girls out there be better pilots and safer pilots and know what you need to know. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. And as always, stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.